But you want to be a lady.
I've left everything I ever had.
I know you think I'm not half good enough.
A very respectable woman.
Give dinner parties and entertain your husband's friends.
I'm sure Cleopatra never bothered about napkin rings.
I'm not a well-behaved.
But I want you to be absolutely perfect.
Hello.
Welcome to the Well-Behaved
Woman Podcast and musical.
A podcast musical. I'm Robin.
And I'm Katrina.
And we are...
Sisters.
Sisters, that's true. We're doing a podcast musical.
We are, but first, we're researching about it.
We have been researching for about 3 months now.
Yeah, and it's been a very interesting journey, which has expanded our project by leaps and bounds.
Yeah, it is definitely it grows and grows and grows and grows.
It sure does.
But it's fun.
Yeah. This episode is the first in a 6-episode series of just presenting the research that we've been doing and the interviews that we've done. And so today we're focusing on the first stage of a woman's life, or the Mennonite woman's life, which often involves immigration. So this one's going to be about immigration, coming to Canada, and growing up as a newcomer to Canada.
Yeah, we kind of, I feel like for me, I'm starting to look at this project as like a musical essay. And so this feels like we're like doing the layout of our essay, and we're like putting all the quotes in their places now so that we can write all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So we're offering you now this research.
Yes.
Yeah. So our first person you're going to hear from is funnily, is this a word? We're going with it. It's funnily a male.
Ironic.
But he's my neighbor, and he just really loves the Mennonites. His name is Chris Sumby. He just finished his master's at Regent, and he studied at...
Is he Mennonite?
He is not Mennonite, but he
Ironic.
is Mennonite. Well, this is our question.
That's the question.
See,
Can
he
you
would call
choose
himself
to
a Mennonite
be?
now. Yeah. But like he wasn't culturally Mennonite. See, we're learning things.
Learning lots.
He's gonna give us our little introduction, a little bit of a quick take on the the Mennonites immigrating to Canada, and like the story, leaving Prussia and all of that stuff. So
Yeah. So here's Chris Sunby.
Conservative Mennonites move around a bunch. More conservative Mennonites, the ones who want to maintain nonviolence or non-resistance or pacifism, whatever you want to call it, they move around. And then they also want to keep their kids out of state schools or public schools. And both these things are, well, obviously the nonviolence is a biblical mandate, and the school issue is to maintain sort of their own cultural distinctiveness or something. Because you start speaking the language of the culture, then you will assimilate to the culture. So those are the reasons often the Mennonites move is education stuff or war. And then in 1786, Catherine the Great, who's doing some reforms in Imperial Russia, invites them to come settle modern day southern Ukraine.
Chris reached out after his interview to ask us to correct this to 1789, not 86.
At the time it was Imperial Russia, and they settled there. And then that's through the 19th century. They farm, and then they eventually get into other industries, and a lot of them make a lot of money, and a lot of them are landless. And so there's a big crisis in the 1860s between sort of massive land-owning Mennonites and the landless Mennonites. Anyway, then what happens is a bunch of things, yada, yada, yada. Fast forward 1905, there's a revolution in Russia that changes some of the stuff around serfs and peasants and that kind of stuff, which affects the Mennonites a little bit. But the big thing that leads to the 1920s migration out of, at that point, it's the Soviet Union, it's the USSR, is the first. You have World War I, 1914 begins, and the Mennonites are not viewed very favorably because they are essentially, well, they're German speaking and they're viewed as Germans, and so that causes them some problems at that time. And then that leads, of course, directly into the Russian Revolution of 1917, and that's not good for Mennonites, especially the rich Mennonites, the estate-owning Mennonites. So the Mennonites in southern Ukraine find themselves on the front lines often, or near the front lines, and so Germany actually has come in and is occupying that region, and the Mennonites like this, of course, because they view themselves as German. The Germans treat them well, whatever. But then as the Germans leave, they arm them. They train some of them. Then in that area, they get stuck on the front lines between the Red Army, led by Trotsky, of course, the communist Bolshevik military. The White Army, who are sort of a reactionary, conservative. They want to bring back, the Tsar and whatever. And then the Black Army, which is sort of led by Nestor Makhno, but also has some elements in it that are sort of more, well, it's anarchist. It's anarchist in ideology, but it's also, like they go into places and they just like blow up the prisons, and then prisoners are free to, join the Black Army. But this, of course, leads to all kinds of issues. The Mennonite story often was that it was this ethnic issue that Makhno and the Black Army didn't like German Mennonites or whatever because they're colonists and they're German and they're different in that sense. But then there's sort of been a reinterpretation around more class dynamics. That it was more of a class issue with very rich Mennonites. But yeah, there's massacres, famous ones, the Eichenfeld massacre. So then that happens. Okay, so then there's the Russian Revolution, the Civil War. The Mennonites are stuck on the front lines of that. A bunch of people die. There's sexual abuse of women. There's all kinds of horrible things that go on, and yeah, it's not good. Then there's a famine, which is also not good. So the Mennonites get affected by the famine. Then there's typhoid that goes through.
Chris also asked us to correct this to typhus instead of typhoid.
And also does some damage. So there's sort of these accumulating bad things. So in the early sort of, I think 1918, 1919, somewhere around there, Mennonites start thinking, we need to get out of here. This is not looking good for us. And so then a bunch of Mennonites in the US, in Canada, in Germany, and the Netherlands, actually, a bunch of them, they all start talking to each other, and they say, how do we get our fellow Mennonites out of Russia? And a lot of them decide to go to Canada. So MCC, also Mennonite Central Committee, begins at this time, 1920, and it begins directly in a response to what's going on. Anyway, they decide, 21,000 leave between 1923 and 26, and they come to Canada, and they are known as the Russlander Mennonites, and they come to Manitoba and they settle. Well, first they spend some time in Ontario with the Mennonites over there, but they hang out with them for a little while. Then they come to Manitoba and settle with the Mennonites in southern Manitoba and in Winnipeg. But they have a massive debt. A bunch of people set up, hey, listen, we'll take on debt to get them to Canada, and they did take on debt to get them to Canada. Then they have to pay off their debts. And these Mennonites coming, the Russlander Mennonites, are often much more educated. Then they come to Canada, and then they settle in with the Canadiers, who are the 1874 following migration folks. And so there's these two major waves to Manitoba, and they kind of get along, but they're very different types of Mennonites. Theologically there's some differences, but also just in like education there's differences, and what it is to be a Mennonite on the land is I think there's different perspectives there too. How a lot of the daughters of these families or these younger women who came ended up working in Winnipeg as sort of servants or maids or whatever. And then there was houses set up for them to all live together, to be kind of watched over in the big city or this kind of thing. And then there's some abuse stuff that happens. Not well, maybe in the homes, I don't know, but in the places where they work. There's sort of abuse stuff that happens, and they're mostly doing this because they have to make money to pay off the debt that their family has incurred from this massive trip out of the USSR to Canada. And there's all this trauma, of course. There's all these dead people who don't make the trip because they're dead, and there's people they left behind, right? There's people who stay. There's a lot of Mennonites who stay. It's 1/3 who leave from the USSR and come to Canada, which means 2/3 stay. And some of the times the family was split between who stayed and who went. And so it was traumatic in that sense too. There's all this violence, all this death, this famine, and then the splitting of families to come settle in an unknown land with a bunch of Mennonites that you sort of get along with. And I think that's sort of the context.
So the next little story we're going to share with you is Maria Friesen. So
a friend of ours, Juliana, is going to be reading the story because her grandma is...
Her Oma
has been a little under the weather, so she's just going to read a story that her Oma had sent to her about her story and some of her memories moving to Canada.
I was thinking about the memory back when we moved here from Russia. maybe it would not be too bad with a different greeting, but when you arrive with a large family and 10 little children, and no one's there when your children are hungry and tired and anxious, looking around there was not one single person. We couldn't speak English or find a taxi, and we needed to, but no one came. Finally, Great Opa came and we were sitting around. No washroom, the children are thirsty, crying. The youngest child, Kate. She was 1 year and 4 months old. After, it was a nightmare. First, Great Opa asked your Opa how much money we have because he had no plans to buy food, and his own fridge was empty. People in the neighborhood heard about us, and some brought a bag of flour, and I had to learn how to bake bread. After spending 2 weeks at Great Opa's house, we moved to a farm to pick raspberries, which wasn't too bad, so we could eat some raspberries as well. I guess God has given me strong, healthy children because God knew what we would have to face. After spending a month or so picking, we could move to a small house. It was so small, but we lived there for 3 years. A funny story, it became funny now, but at the time it wasn't really funny at all. I had a great uncle, and he drove a Volkswagen, and he owned a small trailer since we didn't have much. Anyway, we put our couple bags on it and piled into the Volkswagen. Of course, your Opa, he was a chain smoker, and he was sitting on the passenger seat and smoking, and he threw the cigarette butt out the window, and it landed on our belongings. Of course, what happened was it started a fire, and all of our stuff in the trailer caught on fire. People were passing us and pointing to us, and we were looking back, and it was a bad idea for your Opa to do that. Eventually, we finally got rid of the smoke smell off the burning pillows.
Next on the pod, we have a pretty cool story told by someone we know back from when we lived in Saskatoon. Her name's Chrissy. She's talking about her great, I don't know how many great...
I think it was a great-great-grandma.
grandma. And she's going to tell you a really cool story of her her relatives' immigration to Canada.
Her name is Amelia Wheeler, and it's really cool. It's a really unique story of the relationship between the Indigenous people and the Mennonite people, and just the communities that worked together.
So, you can, if you want to tell us the story of is it your great grandma or grandma? I'm looking. Your grandma?
It's actually my great grandma. So it's my grandma's grandma. Her one daughter was named Marguerite, and that's who my great grandmother is. So she came over in one of the first waves of Mennonites to come over from Prussia. So it was like 1890s, late 1890s, I think. There was a whole wave of people that came to Saskatchewan. And so she came here with her 9 kids and her husband, who is named Isbrand, and her name was Amelia. But sadly, Isbrand died shortly after they arrived. So she was here with 9 children in what I assume was like a very small house on a homestead. Near the South Saskatchewan River. So the story goes, we were always told this story in my family, but I didn't really know if it was true or where this story came from. So interestingly, I was able to find out it was a real story. It really happened. But the story is after her husband died, there was a crazy spring blizzard where she was stuck with her kids and they had run out of supplies. So she sent her sons, I think, some of her sons to the nearby One Arrow First Nation to get help from their neighbors. And so the Chief Almighty Voice went to help them. And so he had to risk his life. He crossed the river, the South Saskatchewan River, it was early spring. So it had started to break up, and that's why she hadn't sent her children across the river into Duck Lake to get supplies because it was too dangerous. But unfortunately, they didn't have supplies because it was spring and, everybody was running out of supplies. So he made the very dangerous crossing to go get things to bring back to her family. And so sort of part of the story that was always handed down was that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Almighty Voice saving my grandma and her 9 kids live. What's really interesting is Almighty Voice is like, I think fairly well known, at least in Saskatchewan, the story of Almighty Voice. Chief Almighty Voice's son, my understanding is that he butchered a cow to feed his family. And at the time, you needed permission from the Indian agent to butcher animals on a reserve. And he asked for permission. They said no. He still butchered the cow because it was their cow and his family needed to eat. So they arrested him for that, put him in jail. And while he was in jail, there was construction in Duck Lake, I think he was going on nearby. And the guards were joking that they were constructing like gallows to hang him. And he spoke limited English, and so he thought they were telling the truth. So he broke out of jail that night, as one would, and was then on the run for years. And it escalated into a whole thing where actually the Canadian Army was called in after he'd been on the run for several years. But this is where it kind of swings back around to my grandmother. So while he was a fugitive, he went to her home for supplies when he needed them because his family had helped her before. Then he stopped there and she let him sleep in the barn and give him food and water. And I think that may have happened a few times where she helped him out, even though he was a fugitive and it was highly illegal to do so. Sadly, eventually they called in the military to, sort of deal with Almighty Voice. And he was murdered by the Canadian Army. So it was a super sad story. But what I found interesting about the story, I mean, there's lots of things to me that are interesting about the story, but I think that there's sort of a narrative about the pioneers that came over. This story was sort of passed down and told, but I didn't know if it was real because there was no record of it until I found there was, so it would have been one of my grandmother's cousins was sharing, it was 1980, and she was sharing with a Mennonite publication the story of her grandma. And that's the only place I can find where it's recorded. Not that we can't rely on oral tradition, but at the same time, my brain is so Western that I just felt like the story needed to be corroborated or validated or something. So my sister actually reached out to a local historian named Bill Wazer. He's a professor at the university before he retired as well. And because in 2020, he wrote a book about Almighty Voice, and he kind of wrote it in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so he actually invited us to have coffee with him and kind of told us his findings about, because he had just published the book. And we were just kind of this is the story. This is kind of the timeline. We just kind of want to know if it's possible, or is this just all a crazy story? And he looked at it and he's like, I actually think I've seen your grandmother's name before. And he's like, I can't 100% say the way you were told it is true. But he said from all of his research, it's very likely. And so he kind of pointed out too, the early Mennonite settlers, there's kind of this narrative about how heroic they were, and there definitely was tenacity and grit and all of the things it took to be newcomers here at that time, but also how, especially in Amelia's story, being a widow with 9 children, she was so vulnerable, and how she relied on her neighbors to survive, and just how he said it kind of shows the reciprocity that was just what was necessary for mutual survival at the time. And yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, and how the story could have been so different without, having those neighbors to help out. And yeah.
Like, and choosing to trust them, and like back and forth, like a real relationship.
Yeah. Apparently some of her children married some of the people from One Arrow First Nation like her too. So I was like, so they got real cozy, yeah.
Yeah, really connected on those long winters.
So I'm super Mennonite, my whole like very Mennonite background. And I realized that I knew the names of all my great grandpas going way back and none of their wives' names. And I knew all of their stories, what they did when they got here, the land that they got given to them or for cheap, and all the things. Um, yeah, about the men in the family. And like, there was zero information about their wives and the women. And so I feel like if Isbrand had survived, we might not have even heard this story about Amelia, because just women were not acknowledged in the story, or at least not very much, or at least not in my family. So it's been interesting to kind of poke around a little bit more and try to find those stories.
What would you say being a Mennonite woman is?
I mean, for me, I think it might look different for other people. So just to give some context, like I have family members who are like old order Mennonites. So they wear dresses and the women wear caps, and men and women sit on opposite sides of the church and everything. So I'm familiar with like those traditions, and obviously I'm not that kind of Mennonite. But for me, I think there's a lot of beauty in some of the traditions that have sort of come through my Mennonite family. I think some of the Mennonite values are things that really I hold on to. So just like family and faith are, utmost, and that's kind of the center and the kind of the grounding spot of Mennonites. So I think I really hold on to that, even though my expressions of faith might not quite look the same. And, for me, I think it's just, teaching my kids those same values. And then some of the fun, things that come with being Mennonite, like roll kuchen and just some of the traditions that I like.
All right, so next up we have an amazing interview with a woman named Marlene Epp. She's a doctor in Mennonite women. She's like taught as a professor, and
she's emeritus. This is a word I've learned just recently. A professor that was retired but still holds the honor title at the University of Waterloo.
We were so excited. We found her by just Googling Mennonite women, like history, smart people. Like, I feel like we were just like, who can we talk to about this? And
she knows everything.
Yeah, her name popped up and we're like, okay, we need to chat with this.
She's like the resident expert on all things, because she has like her whole studies were about like peace and conflict, gender studies, Mennonite women history in general, Mennonite history in general, gender studies, focus studies on the history of immigrants and refugees in Canada, and the history of food and culture, which is like so Mennonite.
Yes, very important.
So she's going to pop up a lot in these episodes, and this is the first one. She's going to talk about just what the life of a Mennonite woman immigrating to Canada would have been like.
And we get to hear a bit of her family history too.
My grandparents came in 1924. So my grandmother, I had all four of them came in the same year, but I only knew my maternal grandmother. She came in, she would have been a young woman. She had two babies when she arrived. I mean, as a newcomer, they, especially during that time period, if they came from Ukraine, from the Russian Soviet Union at the time, they would have come probably with some kind of immigrant trauma shaping who they were. They would, chances are, they would have experienced some family tragedy, whether it was losing people to the famine in the Soviet Union in the early 20s, or whether it was there was a lot of violence. I don't know how much you know about that history, but there was a lot of violence in Mennonite settlements, so they might have lost people to violence. They might have, I mean, and I'm thinking not of a child here. I'm thinking of a young adult person. If you want to talk about children, that's maybe another topic. But as a young woman, she would have been probably full of anticipation about her new life and leaving behind a very dark place of, loss and violence and hunger and tragedy, and coming to complete uncertainty. And her experience would have varied depending on where she lived. A lot of them who came in the 20s would have gone to the prairies, like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and that would have been a very unfamiliar terrain. Some came to Ontario. So my mother's family, they originally came here to Waterloo County, and they lived with Old Order Mennonites for a year, horse and buggy Mennonites. And so my grandma lived in a household. They were almost like a sponsored refugee family, like we're familiar with today, right? So these horse and buggy Mennonites hosted my grandma and grandpa and their babies for almost a year in their home. So these two women would have had to work it out in the kitchen, whether they'd be making sauerkraut or zwieback, or sharing each other's food recipes. That would have been something that might have shaped their experience. They went to Manitoba for a while, but then they went to Pelee Island, which is just off the coast of what's in Lake Erie. It's the southernmost place in Canada, and that's where my mom was born. With the help of a midwife, they had no. I've done a lot of research on Mennonite midwives, and I find that whole story to be very fascinating. So my mother was born with the help of a midwife on the island. I mean, their lives would have been very much of hard manual labor, right? Most of them, they tried to farm, the ones who came in the 1920s. And most of them came with very little money. They would have lost, if they were wealthy in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, they would have lost a lot of their resources. The 1920s maybe were not as hard as mid-19th century, but still there wouldn't have been electricity in many homes yet, maybe not indoor plumbing. And women of that era, unless they had household help, which Mennonites did not have a lot of. In fact, they sent their daughters out to be household help for others. That was very common during this era. Young women, some as young as 13, into their upper teens and early 20s, were hired out to farms, or if they were, or into the city, like Saskatoon, or Winnipeg, or here Kitchener. They would have been hired out in order to earn money to help their family, settle into, have a livelihood in Canada. And that's a fascinating story, because these young women who left home, and we're thinking teenagers here, really, and living with other families, being separated from their own families fairly soon after arriving in Canada, and then living with other families and doing a lot of childcare, doing a lot of cleaning, cooking, and so on. They probably would have reflected society more broadly, but probably more conservative yet, right? The 1920s, this is an era of first wave feminism in North America. So women have recently gotten the vote, and are entering higher education and professions to a certain extent. But Mennonite women I mean, the expectation was pretty much that they would marry, and then they would have children, and their vocation, they wouldn't have called it a vocation. Their role would have been to look after the household and raise children. They would have gone to church. They wouldn't have had a voice in church, a voice. They would have been very influential in church life and very important to the success of churches, but they wouldn't have attended official meetings. They wouldn't have had a vote. If there were Sunday schools in those early newcomer churches, they might have taught Sunday school. But there was, very much separate spheres philosophy about male and female roles. If they didn't marry, of course, then they're, the single women who remain living with their parents, or they become missionaries. So I often thought like becoming an overseas missionary for single Mennonite women was a way to escape the restraints of their communities and their churches, and be adventurous. And secondly, to exercise their gifts of leadership and teaching and so on. Or they might, at this era, they might have been entering professions like nursing or teaching. It depends where they lived. In the US, there were already pretty well-established nursing schools for Mennonite women in this era. And many of those became missionaries. But of course, if you married, you didn't do that. You raised children. My paternal grandmother had 13 children. My mother's mom had 5, much smaller family, but still, your large families, their roles were, they were renowned for their ability to clothe their families and feed their families. But their roles were pretty clearly defined.
All right, are you ready for a Menno Minute?
Woo!
Da, 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 da. I feel like we need a song for this.
Yeah,
maybe I'll write one.
Menno Minute. I don't know.
We might input a song here.
We got the very big honor and privilege of gathering a group of ladies together from my church and my husband's church that he pastors at, Peace Church on 52nd. We gathered them together, fed them some food, gave them some tea, and asked them some questions in exchange, and they very graciously gave us a lot of fun anecdotes and a great time anyways. So there's going to be some little snippets from the conversations we had with them, and here is just some of their stories of their families' backgrounds, history immigrating to Canada.
Grandparents came over in 1958. My mom was born in 1940, so she was 18 when she came. And for my grandma, it was a second marriage because her husband was taken into the Russian War, and she never heard back from him. And I think when they landed in Paraguay, because it was mainly widows, or they didn't know if their husbands were coming, I think if you hadn't heard from your husband in 10 years, you could remarry. So she remarried, and then when we were living here in Canada, she found out her husband was still alive. Oh. But he was still in Russia, and he had remarried as well, and he had his own children, and my grandma didn't want to stay in touch. She sent him a Bible. I don't know what's happened to him since. I'm assuming he's dead because my grandma was born in 1919.
Well, my mom came over with her mother and 6 siblings. My mom was born in 1932, and they left my grandfather behind because he was a prisoner of war. They knocked on the door and they said, come and whatever. So my grandmother brought over 7 children, but they traveled and they ended up in another city, and then MCC sponsored them to come to Canada. And my grandfather got out of prison, but it had been so many years that he wasn't at all interested in his family. So that was the end of
And
that.
his children.
Yep, no communication. Well, I guess prison didn't do him well, you know, just mental health and whatever. But I was fortunate enough to visit him when I was 19 years old in Germany. I mean, I went to travel, and he was like, I knew I could go to him I landed in Germany and spent time with him, and then shortly after, a few of the other aunts ended up visiting him, but that was like, 30 years later.
Well, as my grandmother who came with my mom, and my mom was her only child, so, and had to, her husband was taken away and sent to Siberia, and she didn't hear from him again. So they came in 1948 to Canada, and that was MCC who helped sponsor them, because they left Russia and went to Germany, and MCC sponsored them to come to Canada. Fortunately, my Oma had a sister who lived in Saskatchewan, and they sponsored them to come to Canada. So that's how they ended up here. So you have to be kind of a strongish woman. A lot of women, right? It was women who were taking care of the kids and doing the traveling and being responsible for all that.
My grandmother was actually Lutheran and my grandfather was Baptist in Russia. So they were not Mennonites, but they were German background. So they lived amongst Mennonites and knew of Mennonites. That's on my mother's side. My dad's side was Mennonite. So they were impacted by the war and the starvation of Stalin and got sent to Siberia and all bit, but eventually they did get back to the area of the Ukraine where they grew up. And from there, they did join the Mennonite, when the Germans retreated. So they joined all the Mennonites then, and all the Germans left basically Russia if they could. So they went to Poland, and then eventually where they had to farm because the Germans had, put them all up on farms. And they were basically free labor for the farmers, provided they got food and shelter. Then they got to the MCC refugee camp in Gronau, which was in Germany, just on the German-Dutch border. They lived there for a while. My grandmother had a sister in Saskatchewan, so they were trying to get to her to get to Canada, and they eventually did get to Canada with 4 of their 5 children, who were young adults or adults at that stage. So they did go to, I think it was called Rosenort or something like that in Saskatchewan. My mother and her older sister, unfortunately, were not allowed to come to Canada because they had an eye infection called trachoma, and the Canadian authorities said, no, you can't come to Canada until that is, cured. So they were actually in the Gronau camp for an additional 3 or 4 years. And they converted to, actually the whole family converted to Mennonite during that Gronau encampment. And eventually my mom and sister did rejoin her family. And then they all moved to Yarrow, where they, picked raspberries and strawberries and, did the hops for all the farmers. And then my mother came into Vancouver to do house cleaning for various people, and she met my father here in this church. Some kind of social thing.
Did she live in the house?
She never did live in the house.
Okay.
No, she never lived in the Machenheim, but she lived around here somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, with friends or relatives or whatever. And
Could you explain what the house is, just for the recording's sake?
the Mädchenheim were on 49th Avenue. They were very big houses, basically room and board houses that were run by a couple of Mennonite families or women. That basically the people, the Mennonites that were the girls that were coming over to find jobs in Vancouver could live in and be safe. So they were actually a big social thing. Yeah.
They usually came from.
They usually came from the valley,
From the-
Fraser Valley,
yeah.
to earn some money because it was the Depression and just after the war and everything. So that would have been quite early. So my mother actually did get married in Russia, but her husband was sent off to war, and apparently he was killed because somebody told her, yes, I saw your husband killed. So this was actually her second marriage to my dad. So she was only married for like 6 months or something before her first husband got killed.
So my mother arrived in Canada with my father in 1954. They had been in Paraguay for many years. Before she got married in Paraguay, she had trained as a nurse and worked in the leper hospital for quite a few years. And before she got to Paraguay, she was in Germany, and before Germany, in the Ukraine. A lot of times I think the stories that she has as a kid, like she was the middle of five sisters, and her father was also taken away by the military, and they never saw him again. I can't remember how old she was. But what they had to do to make sure that they lived was they had a silk farm, and their living room was turned into the place where the silkworms lived. So they would go out every day and try and find dandelion leaves and whatever else the silkworms would eat and feed them, and then they would get harvested, and they would have the silk, and they brought that to the what's the community, the communal thing,
Cooperative.
The cooperative. They would bring that there, and then they would start all over again. But I always thought that was really interesting. That she had, and then I guess other stories were that there was one pair of shoes between the 5 girls. So whoever had the shoes that day got to go to school, and it was. When she would tell the story, you could tell, the memories were getting a little more hazy, and they weren't as intense as they used to be. But, to lose your one parent, only get to go to school one day a week, or, whatever. And she had the same thing. She had trachoma in her eyes. And then she also had a lump on her lung, so she wasn't allowed to leave Paraguay. Otherwise, she would have come over sooner because she had sisters living here already too. But eventually, she was able to come over. But once they were here, nobody has said anything, but they didn't know the language. They had to figure out how to do stuff, how to get around, how to ride the bus to wherever, and know where to get off if they were doing day work. And trying to support your husband, so when they were working in a job as well where they didn't know the language, and then you didn't. Yes, you had people around you that spoke German or Plattdeutsch, but to communicate with other people, that must have been so stressful.
Yeah. Just to add to that, my mother said she was a housemaid, but also the child caregiver of several families. Yeah. She actually learned English from the kids.
Yeah.
I don't know much about my parents.
They didn't talk about it?
They didn't want to.
No?
No. My mom was 12 when she came from Paraguay. How she got to Paraguay, I have no idea.
Okay.
My dad came from Poland. They met in Yarrow. The parents were neighbors. Very easy to go visit grandma and grandpa, walk from one to the other. But I don't know too much history. That's important to note as well. That it was hard for than to even tell the story. That's important for us to know.
And it was very close with my grandma, and I would try to get information out of her. And because I used to live, she lived on 46. I'd come up to Fraser Street with the kids in the buggy, hang out with Oma, watch Price is Right, have a glass of wine with her. We were like this when it came to glasses of wine. It's always one glass with, Price is Right or Judge Judy. But she would cry, and I'd be like begging her to tell me stories, and the tears would just run. But then they came out with a book, Up from the Rebel. You know that one?
Yeah.
And she read the whole book in English, and she underlined wherever she was part of the group.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like, she was like all over the place. Like she was like underlining so much. And we passed it around in our family. We all read it. The day she was born, they came to my grandparents' home, and they murdered her father the day that she was born, and they hacked him up. My Oma said hacked them up with an axe. And then her mom died a year later. So she was an orphan from a year old. And so she grew up with a not so friendly uncle. And she had one brother. And she said her uncle had a party of some sort, and she wasn't allowed to eat with the adults. So they had to go into the kitchen to eat, sort of, not to be heard or seen. And it wasn't until afterwards that she realized that the boy that she was at the table with eating dinner was actually her brother.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they had separated them, and they had put the kids in the kitchen and didn't say anything. But isn't that horrible? Yeah, so it was the only time she ever saw her brother.
But I think what I often heard from my mom and my Oma, my Oma would always refer to the people speaking English as the Anglo-Saxons, and my mom did not want anybody to know she was German, even until when she moved into a care home. She didn't want the German newspaper to be delivered there. She didn't want anybody to know she was German, because she felt, because of the war, that she would be discriminated against or treated differently. And so that was one of the things that I think why they kept so close with each other, right? And why we were kind of sheltered here in this church, in this area of Vancouver. And I think I said to you, I felt like I was, even though we were in the big city of Vancouver, I felt like I was very sheltered in our church, and where I went to high school. There was the people from church there. It wasn't until I left that kind of safety.
When my mom and her 6 siblings and mother came over, it was like a 5 or 6 year process. Like my grandfather owned a, what do they call it? You got horses and you put the shoes on, the horseshoes and whatever. Yeah, blacksmith. And so when they took him and the war broke out, he was gone and she was left with all these children. And so they had family, I guess that was Prussia, and they had family in Germany. And the process, they left the house with a carriage. The youngest was 3 years old, and the oldest, my mom was the second oldest. My mom would have been 12 or 13, but they were making their way to Germany, but by foot. And halfway there, they were turned around by the Russians. They went back to their home, but they knew they couldn't stay there. And this is all, it's hard. I asked my mom lots of questions at the time, and her mind was foggy as well. And later on in the years when I was trying to confirm the things, and she wasn't sure, but they ended up at her great aunt's. But it was like I say, I can't remember, 6-7 year process. So it's not like they just got in a plane and flew to Canada, So even that, things were just very different, because you didn't even have a home for all these. You slept out under the stars during the winter too. They didn't leave in the spring and end up in the summer, whatever.
I think for my grandparents, coming to Canada was a land of opportunity. And the stuff that my grandma had seen, this was a walk in the park. She tells stories about because she was a widow with 2 young kids, and she only had 1 diaper for my uncle. When it got wet, she put next to her skin to get it dry, because there was no dryer and washer. And she said, she'd walk along the beach. They had no food, no money. So during the war, there'd be like a dead horse in the ditch, and she would cook that for the kids. And she said it was just so achy, she couldn't eat it herself. Yeah, so they were really happy to come. And I think as well, if you've gone through so much hardship, I mean, the friends that you experience that with, I mean, they were friends for life.
So all of this to say, like, this is such an interesting thing to learn about. Obviously, neither of us immigrated to Canada, so this is not anything we have firsthand experience on. Something that I guess really just was not surprising, but came up for me is just that how much trauma actually is involved in immigrating, especially for these people who are like running from a superpower in another country that's out to get them, right? They're escaping. Some of these stories are just like, wow, how incredible that they were just like hiding on trains and not sure who's going to be opening the doors. Is it the Germans? Is it the Russians? Are they safe? When are they safe? Sleeping in cornfields, not knowing if their husbands are alive, so remarrying. Like, those are just some things that I've never really thought about in the immigration process. And now you're moving to a whole new country, having to learn a whole new language. And like, there's just so much trauma on top of just, I have to move. Yeah.
I read somewhere once, honestly, I was probably listening to a TikTok, but it was, the idea was that one of the largest traumas that is the shared experience between like all humans is moving. And that could be like even just like moving to another part in your own city. And if that alone is one of the biggest traumas we can experience and it like upheaves your whole life, to like literally move countries when you're also fleeing for your life and
like pregnant and having little kids with you, or being a little kid, like what?
And like the a lot of the stories I heard were maybe a secondhand story, but we did hear stories from like people who did these travels and like the casualness where people would just say like, oh, and then my father was killed and that was the last time I saw him, and then we fled and then we went over here and then we ran from the people, and like it's just like these like massive things that how else do you speak of them?
Yeah.
Like,
or you don't speak of them, which we also ran into a lot of people who we'd ask them to interview or ask for their stories, and they'd go, I don't really have a story. I don't really have anything to say. And it's like, yes, you actually really do, but you just don't understand how much of an impact that actually had on maybe even your own life. I don't know.
Totally. I was really interested in so many people came here not speaking English, which is like the common language in Canada, that they came speaking German or Ukrainian or whatever they were speaking at the time. And yeah, they just had to learn a new language while trying to work and trying to like be a part of a new society. And like, I can't fathom. I lived in France for 4 months, and it took me 4 months to feel comfortable enough to say like, wait, yes, I would like that at the grocery store. Like, no, I don't need a bag. Like the smallest things that like the uncomfortableness I felt, and the like, I felt like such an outsider. And to like not have any reference for this language that you're trying to, I can't imagine.
And then at home, like everyone's speaking your native tongue, and so you're not practicing at home either. So
So like today, like we have so many people who are still like immigrating in all the time, and like it's so brave. Like they'll come from wherever they're moving from, and they could be, professors and doctors and these like top lawyers and jobs,
highly intelligent, educated people,
and then you come to a new place and you have to be like, okay, I have to just like work at the grocery store because I need to learn this language and I need to figure out a new society, and my credentials don't cross over, and my like it's so brave.
Very brave and scary and probably humbling too, I would imagine.
Well, we're like filming this today, it's end of January, and it's like where like a lot of the ice is happening just like south of us in the border, and it's I feel like it's very like current to talk about the bravery of these people that are being
refugees and immigrants,
like being sent away, and I think it's like they're so welcome and needed, and they bring so much to our culture and
so much rich history and background. How does this apply to our podcast musical? we should probably talk about that.
That's a great question. How does this apply to our podcast musical?
So our characters, we're basing her, our main character, we're basing her in the 1920s. Her family is going to have immigrated to Canada, but she's going to be born in Canada. So that's something we're going to have to kind of grapple with, is what kind of traumas her family has and how that affects her as she's growing up.
Yeah, we thought it was important that like she was born here, but we really wanted to tell that story of immigration because it's so a part of like a lot of Mennonite people's story.
Something we're discussing is like potentially opening up the musical with her kind of verbally telling the story, but in a really dramatic fashion, and adding a lot of like I don't know, silly kind of kid-isms to the story, as if her family had told her the story and she blew it up in her head to be this like crazy thing. So like that's something we're gonna probably play with a little bit and see what it would look like for a little kid to imagine her family going through this process. Yeah,
because the first episode is gonna be her as a kid. I don't know, we'll say between the ages of like 8 and 12.
Yeah, something around there.
Around that, like a preteen, early teen, where like you hear these stories or you grew up with these ideas, but then you even learning to process them, it's gonna look like very different than
and how that like affects her identity too, having this as her background without it being her present reality.
Totally.
That'll be an interesting thing to play with. So
So we hope you can tune in for that first episode when it comes out. And thanks for listening for today. And we hope you fight the system.
Yep.
And
go melt some ice.
And go be friends with someone who immigrated here.
Yeah,
today.
go learn a story from someone who immigrated.
Yeah, I think that's a good challenge.
Yeah.
Go like talk to a neighbor or take someone out for coffee and
Yeah.
just hear their story.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.